Welcome to my channel. This is Captain Binoy Varakil, Assistant Professor, Department of English, St. Joseph's College, Devgiri, Kozhikode, Kerala. We are discussing On the Sublime, the treaty of Longinus, and this is the third lecture in this series. In the previous two lectures, we looked at the authorship of the treaty On the Sublime, and we just discussed who Longinus was, and we also discussed what we mean by the concept sublime, and we know that sublimity is a certain distinction and excellence in writing. And in the treaty, or in all these 44 chapters of On the Sublime, Longinus helps us understand what is great writing and how a writer can achieve sublimity, and he also tells us the very sources of sublimity. And we know that according to Longinus, there are 5 sources for sublimity, and in this lecture, that is the third lecture in this series, we are looking at the first chapter that is prescribed for detailed study for the postgraduate students of the colleges of the University of Calicut, and the detailed study chapters are chapter 7, 8 and 9, and in this lecture we are reading and discussing chapter 7 of the treaty On the Sublime by Longinus. And Longinus, in the initial 6 chapters, are titled Sublimity, Art of Sublimity, Defects against Sublimity, Frigidity, the Origins of Literary Impropriety and Criticism, and the Sublime. These are the 6 initial chapters of the treaty On the Sublime. And in these 6 chapters, Longinus tells us about the very concept of sublimity and what he means by sublimity in art, and what are the defects against sublimity, etc. And in chapter 7, he is just defining sublime. So chapter 7 is titled The True Sublime. The True Sublime. And we will be reading this chapter in the next slide. And as we read from chapter 7, we will understand that sublimity, according to Longinus, is, for by some innate power the true sublime uplifts our souls. We are filled with a proud exaltation and a sense of wanting joy, just as though we had ourselves produced what we heard. So sublimity is a certain distinction and excellence in writing. So it is in fact a kind of great pleasure, kind of great joy, and emotionally the readers are moved when they read something that is sublime. And an explanation of this we have in chapter 7, and chapter 7 is for detailed discussion, and I will read chapter 7 of On the Sublime of Longinus right now. It is just 2 paragraphs. Please listen. Chapter 7, The True Sublime. It must be understood, my dear friend, that as in everyday life nothing is great which it is a mark of greatness to despise, so is it with the sublime. Thus riches, honors, reputation, sovereignty, and all the other things which possess in marked degree the external trappings of a showy splendor would not seem to a sensible man to be great blessings, since contempt for them is itself regarded as a considerable virtue. And indeed, people admire those who possess them less than those who could have them, but are high-minded enough to despise them. In the same way, we must consider, with regard to the grand style in poetry and literature generally, whether certain passages do not simply give an impression of grandeur by means of much adornment indiscriminately applied, being shown up as mere bombast when these are stripped away, passages which it would be more noble to despise than to admire. For by some innate power the true sublime uplifts our souls. We are filled with a proud exaltation and a sense of wanting joy, just as though we had ourselves produced what we had heard. If an intelligent and well-read man can hear a passage several times, and it does not either touch his spirit with a sense of grandeur or leave more food for reflection in his mind than the mere words convey, but with long and careful examination loses more and more of its effectiveness, then it cannot be an example of true sublimity. Certainly not unless it can outlive a single hearing. For a piece is truly great only if it can stand up to a repeated examination, and if it is difficult or rather impossible to resist its appeal, and it remains firmly and ineffaceably in the memory. As a generalization, you may take it that sublimity in all its truth and beauty exists in such works as please all men at all times. For when men who differ in their pursuits, their ways of life, their ambitions, their ages, and their manners all think in one and the same way about the same works, then the unanimous judgment, as it were, of discordant voices induces a strong and unshakable faith in the object of admiration. So this is what Longinus tells us about sublime, or being sublime, or sublimity. Okay, so we understand that sublimity is a certain distinction and excellence in writing, and he also tells us about the effects of sublime. So as we read in this chapter, we understand that for by some innate power the true sublime uplifts our souls. When we read something that is sublime, our souls are uplifted. We are filled with a proud exaltation and a sense of wanting joy. Okay, so this is the result of something that is sublime. So he subsequently speaks in the treatise about the effects of sublime, and according to Longinus, the effects of sublime are loss of rationality, an alienation leading to identification with the creative process of the artist, and a deep emotion mixed in pleasure and exaltation. So when we read something that is sublime, we forget, okay, and we are emotionally moved. And in the treatise, Longinus gives us examples for sublime works, and according to him, an example of sublime is a poem by Sappho, and it is called Ode to Jealousy. And Longinus says that the Ode to Jealousy by Sappho is a sublime ode, and it is just lifting the reader to great happiness, great joy. So, according to Longinus, a writer's goal is not so much to express empty feelings, but to arouse emotion in his audience. This is very important. A writer's goal is not so much to express empty feelings, but to arouse emotion in his audience. And Longinus asserts that the sublime leads the listeners not to persuasion, but to ecstasy. For what is wonderful always goes together with a sense of dismay and prevails over what is only convincing or delightful, since persuasion as a rule is within everyone's grasp, whereas the sublime, giving to speech an invincible power and strength, rises above every listener. So, Longinus says that the sublime works will transport, that is to, of course, he uses a term like transport. The effect of a lofty passage is transport, that is, a sublime passage, a sublime poem, a sublime literary work will transport or move the reader to ecstasy. And this transformation or this transport or moving the reader to ecstasy is through a magic of speech. Okay, so in chapter 7, Longinus defines true sublime, and he also tells us the very effect of sublimity. And chapter 8, he talks to us about the different sources of sublimity that we will see in lecture number 4. Thank you very much for listening.